this interview. My name is Mora Beauchamp-Byrd. I'm Director of Museum and Cultural Heritage Studies and also an Associate Professor of Art History at Florida State University. And I'm an art historian, a curator, and have been an arts administrator. And my areas are art of the African diaspora, art of the Americas, including the Caribbean, Latin America, and modern and contemporary African American art. And I also teach museum and curatorial studies. And regarding comics, I teach courses that deal with race and gender in American comics, and then sort of broader, more general histories of American comics, including graphic novels and animation. And one of my more recent exhibitions has been a show called Little Nemo's Progress, Animation and Contemporary Art in 2019 at Oklahoma State University Museum. My chapter is really focused on a strip called Candy. And I'm interested in because this action-driven romance and adventure strip. It's that's focused on a young female engineer, that is operating this auto racing, company with her father. And this is a strip that starts around 1954, 55, and published in the Courier. It seemed to replace Jackie Orms's popular Torchy Brown series after Orms retired. And this was basically a genre-focused study, but also one that looked at questions about how did romance comics featured in African-American newspapers mirror and or differ from those produced by larger mainstream syndicates. And that's part of a larger project. But I just wanted to focus on Candy in particular because there hadn't been a lot written on this particular strip. But I was interested in the representation of Candy, her just in terms of physiognomically, how she looked and what was distinctive about her representation. How did Hollingsworth's image of Candy fit in with idealized representations of beauty in the African American media? So I'm looking at, what's happening with Ebony, what's happening with the NAACP's publication, The Crisis. And I'm seeing so many similarities with Lena Horne and other figures. But also, I had to consider the fact that here's Hollingsworth working in the mainstream comics world. He's doing white, good girl images of women. So she, I asked friends, who is this woman? And I took out the text and title and showed them images of Candy. Right. And I said, who is this woman? Everybody said it's Wonder Woman. Oh. so she had a distinctly different physiognomic look in comparison to the other Black characters in the strip. I think for newcomers, whenever I talk about, what I'm working on with the, Courier comics, or even just about, African-American newspaper comics in the golden age, there's this surprise about the existence of those comics. And so I think that my approach is to not just focus on, oh my God, this is so interesting that this was produced in this period, but to focus also, on, what were some of the narratives in particular, but also as an art historian to look at these using the various approaches that we use as art historians, whether it's formal analysis, whether it is semiotics, whether we're thinking about psychoanalysis in terms of all of those approaches. I'm also interested in the way that the figure of Hollingsworth is navigating different spaces, at different points in his career. Like, Blair has talked about, this is a really rich, successful, prolific career that's happening. And one of the things that was interesting to me, I'm still trying to find the answer, as to how Hollingsworth got involved with the, producing candy,
Mhm.
you know, and how much agency he had or didn't have in terms of the storyline. Because on one hand, it seems to be a continuation of a sort of romance slash adventure comic that's happening, with a strong female lead, that is very independent, physically attractive. I looked at the similarities between what was happening with Torchy and Heartbeats and with the Candy image as well. And so those are the kinds of things that I think those who are unfamiliar with comic studies
Mhm.
are interested in. And then for my students, once they have the tools of the various methodological approaches, they feel more comfortable in reading the image with much more complexity.
That's right.
So they're looking at the, what's happening pictorially, and also what's happening with the text, and then what's happening with symbolism there. Also, I could not ignore the similarities between Candy and Lena Horne.
Mhm.
And part of my process was really looking at, you know, um, how Lena Horne looms large in African American media during that period, in Ebony, in, as I mentioned before, The Crisis, which was published by the NAACP, um, and women who looked similar to Lena Horne,
Mhm.
also. And so I wanted to think, what did that signify in terms of a sort of respectability politics, in terms of a look, for African American communities.
I like this phrase that you mentioned a couple of times about speculating on Hollingsworth's agency in his rendering and in his artistic choices. I think this is a place where uh, the importance of the work at the Courier and working on these in these predominantly Black newspapers becomes especially important. Not necessarily that Orms had carte blanche to do whatever she wanted, but when we think about sort of agency to make choices, it feels like she stands apart as one of those cartoonists who would have had a lot of that agency, being able to decide the kinds of directions she wanted to go, what she wanted to comment on, either whether or not she's doing editorial cartoons. Sometimes she editorializes. Would you? So I that's not really a question, more like a comment, but I'm curious if you all have any thoughts on that, or what you think about this notion of how we assign or speculate about agency in an artist's choices.
Yeah, I think I she has been seen as someone who, because she was able to write for her
Mhm.
comics and produce the pictorial, that and because she has been celebrated, more recently. Um, and I think, Eli, you may have brought this up. There's this idea of her as being, um, singular, as if she's just there producing, with no input and whatnot. And I think, because we want to celebrate her, her contributions, and so you start to think that she was able to affect everything around her. I think that's part of, what happened, and just because she's associated with this idea of the groundbreaking, and
Mhm.
that's how she's described, the pioneering, the groundbreaking. So we give her an agency, and we, I don't know, Eli, if you've come across more detail about any kind of directive that might have come from, the Courier and other places, because her work was quite different from the other images, which were centered around male characters on the pages.
I can't claim that I came across a lot in the Courier files. There wasn't a lot in the Courier archives that I had access to in Pittsburgh about her frankly. There's a lot of her records are carried elsewhere due to her records being parceled up by different collectors and archives over the years. A lot of it's in Chicago. She lived in Chicago for the majority of her comics producing career. But I will say that this thinking not only of her as a kind of unconstrained pioneering figure, which is something we often talk about, comes with its own constraints if we think too much about people as pioneers. It's something we talk about a lot in film studies as well, that if we talk about the value of some artist or producer as being valuable because they are the first at something, we can lose our perspective on other things that we ought to value or think about in regards to them. And I think a lot of what I wanted to say with the chapter was that, yeah, she is really unique and she does have a lot of personality that's unique to her. But she's also articulating a position that represented a lot of people at her paper, in her class position, in her city, in her culture, that was not unique to her alone. Like, she was unique, but she also spoke from within a particular position that represented a lot of people's viewpoints. One thing I think in drawing on this distinction between Alvin Hollingsworth and Jackie Ormes that's worth thinking about is that there is a difference of gender and class involved in. Jackie Ormes lived in a dual income household. Her husband ran a very prominent hotel in Chicago, and so I don't think she had to do like work for hire in the same way that Alvin Hollingsworth did. And the fact that Alvin Hollingsworth had to constantly be working in lots of genres for lots of publishers, that's a very different career path for what Jackie gets to do at the Courier. And so I don't know to what degree editorial ever had feedback about tone this down or focus on this. It's hard to say. And based on what we know of her, it seems like she did have pretty wide editorial control over what she put out. And it's also worth saying, I think, women like Hazel Garland and Toki Johnson, who wrote columns where they profiled Jackie Ormes, they explicitly sort of drew connections between Jackie and the characters that she was drawing. They said it looks like her. They're kind of self-inserts, things that historians now kind of assume about the comics. Those are assessments of the comics that we see when they're coming out from her friends. And so the historical memory we have around her is in part shaped by this discursive world that I'm trying to incorporate into the analysis. So as far as thinking about the agency, the independence of these two artists, I think we have to think about how they were framed at the time and what the particular, Alvin Hollingsworth, I'm assuming, had the assumption that he needed to be a career man and a breadwinner. I don't know much of his personal life, and his life, as both of you have said, is under researched by comparison to Jackie. But Jackie Ormes, obviously there's other constraints that come with gender for her position, but she did have potentially a type of freedom to only be working on what she really wanted to work on. And which is not to say that Alvin Hollingsworth ever, didn't care for his work, but it is a different position to be creating comics and art from within.
Mm.
And it also reminds me of the old line that comic books were so disrespectful and disrespected in the 40s and 50s that every creator wanted to go on and do their own comic strip, because that's where the respect came and that's where the control came. And so it's really interesting to see Hollingsworth move into that space for such a relatively short period of time in the mid 50s. And then he went on to do like pulp magazines in the late 50s, but then found his place and found his role making work that spoke to his own interests in the avant-garde.